On behalf of the Women's Leadership and Resource Center at the University of Illinois Chicago, welcome to our program today, Artist Activists Reimagining Justice. We're so happy to have you with us. A little bit about our program. So this Women's History Month, WLRC, is hosting dialogues with artists, activists, and educators to explore socially engaged, community-based work and consider questions like, how do women and gender nonconforming artists who are Black, Indigenous, and people of color decide to use their creative skills to bolster social justice movements? How does their work engage racial and economic justice to imagine new possibilities with and for their local communities and beyond? How do they bring this work into the academy and vice versa? Earlier this month, we hosted a lively dialogue with artist activists Aram Han Cifuentes and Lisa Woolfork about their work as textile artists. We're so excited to host today's dialogue with Quenna Barrett and Ji-Yeon Lee. Quenna Barrett is a theater artist and practitioner whose work gathers folks of diverse backgrounds, centers marginalized identities, learns from Black radical wisdom, and then dreams collectively to act boldly through those learnings. She is the Associate Director of Education and Engagement at the Goodman Theater, a company member with the Illinois Caucus for Adolescent Health's For Youth Inquiry Company, an associate artist with Pivot Arts, an adjunct professor at DePaul University, and a member of the leadership circle of the Center for Performance and Civic Practice. Ji-Yeon Lee is an interdisciplinary artist whose work explores dynamics of history, power, and resistance through performance and socially engaged projects. Her work has been shown in Chicago, Detroit, Santa Fe, Ohio, Missouri, and France. She has worked with social justice and community-based organizations for over 30 years in immigrant rights, economic justice, LGBTQ issues, and domestic violence. She holds an MFA in Fiber from Cranbrook Academy of Art, an MA in Ethnic Studies from University of California at Berkeley, and a BA in Linguistics from Stanford University. You can read their full bios also on our website. I've asked Quenna and Ji-Yeon to begin by telling us about their journeys as artists, how they got started, what some of their major projects have been, their paths to activism, and some of their influences. Quenna, can we start with you?
Sure. How did I get started? I feel like even, claiming the identity of artist, activist is something I still struggle with. And so certainly I am very appreciative to be invited into this space amongst the sort of artist activists who are here. And when I think about how did I get started, I feel like there was never a moment where I wasn't thinking about social justice, even if I wasn't thinking about it in those terms. I can remember just always feeling sort of impacted by large issues of the world, right? And maybe that's partially because I'm a Cancer, but I've always sort of felt drawn to people and to community. And once I discovered theater, I quickly realized that could be a way to communicate, right? And to have conversations about difficult issues through an embodied way, right? In ways that we don't typically have access to. And so, I always thought I wanted to be a singer, but I never took singing lessons or anything like that. There were folks certainly in my family who were artists. And so that felt like a viable field. It felt like a viable option. And I also think about my granddad, who's a pastor on the South Side of Chicago. He actually this month is celebrating 54 years of service, right? Of pastoral service. And so, I feel like growing up, I always had this spirit of wanting to serve community. And so I certainly attribute part of that to that. And when I was studying theater in college at a predominantly white institution, which I didn't call it that then, it was college. That's what it was. I was like, this is where I am now, right? I'm not on the South Side anymore. Here we are. And I realized that the kind of work we were making, like it didn't feel accessible, right? I was like, my mother's not going to want to come watch this show. She'll fall asleep. She won't be interested. And at the same time, there were particular issues that were happening back here that I felt really called to. certainly I had friends who had gotten pregnant, at a young age. And there was this case of a young man, and I'll say his name, Darian Albert, who experienced some violence, partially due to a school closing, right? Not unlike what we saw come from Ram a couple of years later. And I felt really called to, like, I was angry. I didn't know what to do. I was like, this isn't right. This shouldn't be happening. Why do I get to be at school here studying this thing that feels abstract and not sort of with people, right, who are literally dying. And so, I started taking community-based theater courses. I realized that was an option, right? I realized that there was language and there were tools. And I was introduced to Augusto Boal's work, Theater of the Oppressed. And I was like, oh, this is the thing. This is like, how do I do this in Chatham? How do I do this in Bronzeville? And so, as an undergraduate, I started to sort of think about that. And so I won't sort of go through the whole long schooling journey, but, that really got me invested in how do we use the tools of theater to tell the stories from our perspective, right? Because that also didn't feel like a thing that was happening. As a young Black person from the South Side of Chicago, I felt like we were inundated with images and stories of us that also didn't feel true to my experience. And so I got interested and invested in, let's do this with young folks on the South Side of Chicago. And so I was able to do that work through the University of Chicago's Arts Incubator, which is in Washington Park, right? It's off campus. And we partnered with After School Matters. And I, had the privilege of working with teens for several summers to build their own short plays about issues that were proximate to them. And also, right, about like the joys that they were experiencing, right? So it wasn't just this narrative of despair, but, actually asking them, okay, well, what might we do differently, right? If this is the issue, how can we work together as a community to sort of circumvent that? And so that's what we did. And we would have the openings, the public showings, right, would invite their family members to also like into that conversation, right? So that the conversation didn't just stay with the young folks, but that they could then have these discussions with their parents and their grandparents or whoever their caregivers were. And we did an intergenerational version of that program where we got folks who were as young as 11 and folks who were as old as 77 together talking about, well, what are the issues? How do we perceive each other across this age divide? And I love this story. One of the older gentlemen who participated, he said that at the beginning of the program, he judged this young man because he came in with his pants sagging and his hood on, and he wasn't participating. And so, he had this very narrow view of him, but by the end of the program, right, they had developed a relationship, which then changed how he looked at young people outside, right? Not even in just that program. And so, certainly I consider like community building as part of my activism, right? Like that's part of the thing that I hope to do. And so I do a lot of participatory theater because of that, right? Like I'm hoping to sort of, again, right, like use those tools of discussion, of analyzing, power of analyzing, well, what are the things that we're facing, and working together to solve issues. So relatedly, one of the projects that I recently did is a project called Rewriting the Declaration, which happened in the fall of 2020. So, right, a lot of context happening. The play happened literally, it was bookended by the election. So there was so much happening to respond to, right? And it was devised. The ensemble built the play together, right? And the original question was, what if we rewrote the Declaration of Independence from a Black queer feminist lens, which I learned from organizing with Black Youth Project 100 and the Let Us Breathe Collective. And, having worked with them, that sort of shifted, right, how I thought about my own work and how I thought about these community collaborations. And so I'll share briefly just one clip from that play. and I'll say that the play was live, right? But there were these pre-recorded elements. And so this is one of the pre-recorded elements that I'll share just to sort of give a sense of the kind of spirit and like how we were navigating multiple sort of layers.
Do you compare your complexion to a person of color and say, see, we're almost the same shade?
After a Black woman finishes her sentence, do you start your sentence with, well, actually?
Do you reinforce the harmful gender binary by saying things like, real men do blah 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 blah, and real women should do yada 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 yada?
Did you think the Women's March was enough?
Maybe she's
born with it.
Maybe it's white supremacy.
Maybe it's white supremacy.
Side effects of white supremacy may include having the privilege to stay out of controversial matters, posting a black square on your Instagram as your sole act of solidarity, protecting land that doesn't belong to you, calling the police as a first resort, calling the police on your black and brown neighbors, not being afraid of the police literally not at all, not even a little bit, thinking all black people look the same, thinking it's a good idea to touch black people's hair, thinking any of the following presidents or vice presidents were going to save this country just by virtue of being in office: Obama, Trump, Biden, Harris, Abraham Lincoln, shopping at Walmart, Target, Amazon, or Aldi, not sure what they did yet, but I know it's something, y'all ain't slick, experiencing feel of accountability, having the thought she's pretty for a dark-skinned girl, thinking European hair is the only good hair, obsessing over sharp jawlines, feeling like someone being harmed or violated sexually is their fault because of what they wear, capitalism, demonizing indigenous and African spiritual practices, believing that black on black crime is actually a thing, saying Blue Lives Matter, believing that the poor can pull themselves up by their bootstrap, historically having made fun of your classmate who wore an afro and now buying it in bundles, thinking all Spanish speakers love spicy foods, referring to the redistribution of wealth as looting, or using transphobia and homophobia as a means to assimilate. You may also experience delusions of safety, entitlement, feeling exempt, and invincibility. Please contact Google, not the nearest person of color, if you notice any of these taking place within you, and medicate with as much research as possible in order to remedy.
So, right, just a bit of how we were hoping to use sort of humor and lightness to really investigate, issues that have existed, that continue to exist, that continue to impact us as folks of color. The ensemble was 7 Black folks and 1 person of color. Half of the cast identified as queer, 1 identified as non-binary. So really, we were trying to center, right, like use that Black queer feminist lens in every aspect of that project. I know my time is running shortly here. I think, yeah, those are the things that I'd like to say just by way of intro, and maybe other things will come out later. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kwana. And yes, there's so much more to talk about, and we'll get to that, right? So let's go ahead and I'll ask Jian if you want to introduce yourself and your journey.
Sure. Oh, that's so exciting, Kwana. I love, I love everything you said and the video that you just showed. I can't wait to talk more about that and the rest of your work. I prepared some slides because it makes me nervous to talk, and it's helpful for me to have props. So in terms of sharing a little bit about who I am and where I come from, I thought I'd start with these 2 women. On the left is my grandmother, my father's mother, who helped to raise me. And on the right is a very sweet picture of my mom when she was in high school, which is a great age for me to think about her. A lot of what I do now and a lot of what has shaped me as an artist and what I do around social justice is a lot about place. And a lot of that is my own experiences of moving, mostly when I was a young person, but also some as an adult, and just living in all of these different places and having to navigate different languages, different cultures, living in Europe when I was young, and then moving to Chicago when I was 9. All of those were really big things that impacted how I think about the world and my place in it. I did start an ethnic studies PhD program at Berkeley pretty soon after I graduated undergrad, and I realized it was not for me. Um, and I'm glad I learned that fairly early on. And then I just got involved with different organizations and different groups. And then I had grown up mostly in Chicago, and I was living in the Bay Area for college and through my 20s. And then when I came back, I was really trying to figure out what it meant to be part of the Korean community here that I had grown up in. So I worked and got involved with a couple of organizations, and then and all of this time I had been working in nonprofits doing program work and fundraising. And then I started thinking about art. I got a job at Columbia College, fundraising, grant writing. And I took art classes there, and got really involved with the staff union while I was there, which was extremely satisfying. There's nothing, I have to say, there's really nothing like being literally on the other side of the table from management and telling them that no, they cannot raise our health insurance costs because we say so, and you have to negotiate with us to do that. Yeah, that's one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had. And I highly encourage anyone who ever thinks about organizing or being part of a union to do it. So I sort of finally, scrounged up enough courage and confidence and a portfolio to actually make a switch from thinking about myself as a nonprofit worker to actually thinking of myself primarily as an artist. And in terms of material and techniques and medium, mostly what I had been doing and what I knew most about was quilting. So I was making quilts that reference my history and my family. And then this is the back of that quilt. These are actually some of my grandmother's clothing. And then I ended up going to art school in Detroit. And I realized this was the first time as an adult that I had lived somewhere that was totally new to me. And it was just this incredibly discombobulating place, and partly as a result of what I was trying to figure out about being there, being at this very elite institution in a very wealthy suburb of a metropolitan area that was anchored by a predominantly Black, predominantly poor and working class city, surrounded by such segregated white suburbs, was to actually make this the focus of what I was doing there for my artwork. And that is when I started using walking as a way to try to look at how places have developed and the histories of racism and colonization that define current structures of exclusion, of domination, of place-based violence. So I did these long walks for like 10 to 11 hours on these roads. And these were roads that were built on what had been roads created by Native people before settlers came. And then when the settlers came, they just built right on top of them. I thought it was important to not just do those walks anonymously, but be to mark myself as part of the landscape and in the landscape. So this is a traditional Korean dress made out of denim, which is this amazing conglomeration that distills the history of slavery and settler colonialism in one fabric. With it being cotton and dyed with indigo. So I thought that would be appropriate. And not unlike Chicago, walking long distances like that puts you in spaces that look both like this and like this. And that was part of what I was trying to witness through the walks. So I've done that several times. When I moved back to Chicago, I did that here too. And it was really interesting to do that in a place that I knew so much more about. But to walk these roads, these were 20-mile walks, which I have to say is so much easier than 25 miles in one day. But to use the occasion of these walks to walk through places both that I knew or that I was at least slightly familiar with, as well as places I didn't know at all, but to see the continuity of neighborhoods that just butt up against each other, but are so different. And I use that as a way to try to learn more about all the different neighborhoods and communities, and see like literally how they've been shaped by racism and colonization at the core of what the land is used for, who can live there, what they do there, what features they have, what amenities, even just the condition of the streets is very obvious from when you see the demographics. So my work as an artist, I realized, oh my gosh, being an artist just means like you can do all of these things that you want to do and call it art. Ah, this is so great. So I've discovered that one of the things I love is research. And so in the walking projects, I try to figure out how to share what I learn in ways that make sense. And so this with this series of walks in Chicago, mostly I used Instagram posts. So in addition to solo walking projects, I've also done socially engaged pieces that are meant for other people to walk, either individually or in groups. And so this was my MFA graduate thesis project, was a little institutional critique of the land, 319 acres at Cranbrook, which was bought by a white man who had made money through journalism in the early 1900s. So this was an audio walk that looked at different aspects of basically the sense of entitlement to shape and structure the land, and then contrasting that with Indigenous perspectives on land. And also using this as a way to share some of the thinking and research that I was exposing myself to. And the last project that I did was that I've done was also, well, it's the largest project I've ever done, but it was also a socially engaged piece, making a line out of red sand in downtown Chicago for 1.5 miles between Roosevelt and the river, to mark what is unceded land, unceded native land. Pretty much all of the green space, and park space and beaches along the lakefront, I've now discovered is landfill. And in the early 1900s, one of the Pokagon Potawatomi bands, the Pokagon Potawatomi Band of Indians, sued the city of Chicago for that landfill, saying that it extended beyond the line, the boundary that had been set for when the treaties that Ramona referred to, and when those treaties were signed, and it went to the Supreme Court and they lost. And as someone who went to CPS and went to high school in the suburbs, I learned so little, really nothing about anything remotely related to Native people, let alone like this actual historical incident that argues for the unceded nature of the land that we enjoy. So that was the route, and we made a line out of red sand, and it was really incredible it was it was incredible to do it. The fact that people showed up, that I was able to work with a group of very generous Native folks, including some from the Pokagon Potawatomi band, as well as folks in Chicago, to plan this procession and handle 2,000 pounds of sand along the sidewalk, and really satisfying to get to make this intervention in front of these historical monuments, and the site of Fort Dearborn, and to really just mark the space. So yeah, so that's a little bit about my journey to where I am now. We'll stop that. Okay.
Thank you so much, Gian. Oh my goodness. Okay, there's so much to talk about here, but I want to give you both a chance if there's something from what each other shared in the beginning, if there's anything that you want to ask about or comment on for each other.
One question that's coming up for me now, just based on the slide that you just shared, Gian, where there's like a cop on a bicycle, and I don't know that folks saw it, but I'm curious, like how do you sort of navigate the state systems, right, when you are executing these public interventions, and how does or how can that become a part of what you're saying, or the art itself?
Yeah. Getting the permit for that project was a long, drawn out endeavor, and we thought about not getting a permit. And if I had my druthers, I wouldn't. But just that whole process itself encapsulated the issues that are at the heart of the project, which is like, who controls this land? Who controls the land that we're on? Who controls public space? Who gets to say what happens on it? Because there were going to be young people and elders involved, and people from out of town, we decided it would be better to try to be as legit as possible. We didn't end up getting the permit approved until the day before the procession, and the police presence was a surprise. We didn't know that was going to happen. They appeared, and it seemed best to to be as cooperative as possible, and recognize their humanity as much as we could of the individuals, and try to actually work together. So yeah, and I know, with the protests around the Columbus Monument and other things, there have been much more violent attacks on people trying to talk about and bring attention to the same issues. So it's we didn't frame, this wasn't intended to be a protest. It was a statement, a creative statement. And when the city wanted us to make sure that the sand was cleaned up right afterwards, we said, yes, okay, yeah, we'll clean it up. There was a little bit of a miscommunication, and so the sand ended up staying on the ground for a few more days than what the city thought. So that was exciting. I enjoyed that. But I think it's I think with you're challenging something structural when the state violence appears, right? So yeah. I have a question for you. So how do you, so in these, in the projects that you've done that are so much about working with and lifting up community voices, what are some of the things that you think about as you navigate your role in those projects? As a member of the community, as an artist, as a director, as a facilitator?
Yeah, that's a great question. And certainly I think it shifted. So it has shifted, right? How I think about my role. And it also depends on, is the context, is it a closed community, right? Or when is it open? For instance, when working with the teens, right, it was just us for 6 weeks, for 4 days a week, for 4 hours a day, versus when we then like open that up to a public, right? My role shifts even within the project, within the scope of a project. And certainly, right, it's this kind of insider outsider. Sometimes I think about it in the lens of researcher, right? In some ways, which doesn't feel quite right. But that comes up, certainly, right? Because then I go and then I make this piece, right? Based off of all of those experiences. But really, especially for a long time, I resisted the word director, right? Like that's not what I was doing in the Theater of the Oppressed work. Like that is facilitation, right? It might be mediation at some times. It is like space holder or space keeper, right? And I think really intentionally about how do I create the space where folks can come in, especially in those closed contexts, to really feel comfortable, right? To talk about the things that they are navigating. A lot of times we'll hear facilitators, and even now in classroom spaces and rehearsal spaces, and I'm glad these conversations are happening, right? That we are doing community agreements in classrooms and in rehearsal spaces. And we also, the term safe space gets brought up a lot. And that never felt quite right. And then sort of in my work with Let Us Breathe Collective, Christiana Colon says brave space, right? That we can make these spaces braver by showing up, by being vulnerable, but there's always the potential for harm, right? And so I also have to think about that as the facilitator in the sort of the creation of how we hold space together. And then especially with young folks, even not with just young folks, with anybody where we're working sort of to build something together over a long period of time, I hope that I can sort of step away from facilitation and that I can invite the participants themselves, right, to sort of take leadership and ownership of that process is really also how I think about a long-term project. Sometimes it's the role of provocateur, right? If I think in the terms of Theater of the Oppressed, the facilitator, the role is called the joker. When you are inviting people from the public to sort of intervene. So like you kind of have to, right, poke and prod and be a bit of a clown, right? Sort of point things out as if they were preposterous, because most of these issues are, right? And so you kind of get to lean into the trickster role. And again, just depends on the context. All of that is wrapped up in that.
I think just part of the reason why I asked that is because I can, so much of it is about relationships. And relationships get built through working together. And because of the nature of the work that we do, they're often very project-based or time-based. And so, so projects end, right? And in the organizing world, there might be campaigns that end, but the relationships don't end because you have an organizational structure for the relationships to continue over time as you keep working on issues and figure out what the next campaign is. So I just wonder, like, as you, how do you think about, like, and often, I mean, from what it sounds like, it seems like when you're creating and working on these projects, there's a big collective experience that happens and then it's over. So what do you do after it's over? How do relationships continue? How do you think about that particular group of people or that neighborhood, or like what is our role as people who might not always be from that specific community? You go in, you do something, and then, like, do you leave? How do you leave?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I have some thoughts. And then I think, I'm curious as to sort of what your response to that would be, and would love to hear you talk more about your role in the We Will Chicago project, right? Because I think that there are some similar aspects to that. So my answer, yes, you leave. Yes, the project is over. And that actually is one of the tensions, I think, at least that I've experienced in the Theater of the Oppressed work is usually, right, like those programs that I've facilitated are 6 weeks. And even if we have the community conversation, right, during the public showing of the play that we've spent those 6 weeks on, what happens next, right? And usually we don't build that, or haven't figured out how to build that into the grant or into that program structure. And so it does kind of just fall away. What Theater of the Oppressed calls for, right, is for that community to continue to work together, to then work with policymakers, to work with local alder folks, right, like to address those issues. And that is something that I am interested in doing. So if anybody here wants to fund that work, let's talk. But that is something I have not been able to do, unfortunately. I will say, because a lot of the work that I have experienced has been kind of at a hyper local level, right? So what I didn't say earlier is the Arts Incubator is down the street from my church, right? And a lot of the students that I work with went to high school or go to high school where I went to high school, right? And so I think that certainly working in a particular neighborhood, right, allows for just organic community, right? That long-term relationships, just because I will see them inevitably. And then social media has helped, right? Certainly I've been in touch with folks. There's one actor who was in the show, who was in the first version of the program that I ran, several years ago. And because we've stayed in each other's orbits, we were able to make that happen. Also, another person who was an intern at the organization where I work now, a former intern, also was in the play, right? So again, I do think in some ways I have maintained relationships, but at a large scale, I think it's a great question and something, I want to keep thinking about. I had another response, but I don't know where it went. So I'm going to turn it back to you. Would love to hear you sort of talk about how you navigated that through We Will.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about We Will in a second, but yeah, it's something that's on my mind a lot, especially in this period of time as I'm trying to make work that is in solidarity with the goal of decolonization. So, how do I, as a non-Native person, build real and authentic and hopefully long-lasting relationships with Native people, and do that like not for a goal. So far, I think I've needed the vehicle of doing these projects to have a reason to even initiate relationships, and to they've been vehicles for building relationships. And I'm doing a follow-up project now about the shoreline. But I've been thinking about how after this current project that I'm working on now, after it's done, how to be in enough communication and contact with people so that projects occur from the relationships themselves, and from the connections. And I don't know if that's possible, but that seems, it's a particular kind of role to navigate about for the Lakefront project. Somebody described my role as both like sitting in the driver's seat and the back seat at the same time. And that's an interesting thing to try to do. Yeah. And I think with the sort of the racial positioning of Asian Americans in this country. And as an immigrant, like it's interesting and tricky to figure out how to support the larger liberation struggles and also like be myself, right, with my background and my experience and my knowledge that I bring. So yeah, I have to say that after so many years of working in institutions, I find it incredibly liberating to not be affiliated with an institution. I mean, I do teach at the School of the Art Institute, and I'm part of organizations, but I don't have I don't have quite the same roles as I have before, where so much of the work was about changing the internal dynamics of organizations and institutions. And I may go back to that at some point, but it's been very freeing actually to have projects that do end. And then you can sort of like let things go, and not everybody has to be, not you don't have to make sure everybody's invested in the same way, and like so that's been freeing for me. Yeah, so in terms of We Will Chicago, so you and I both worked on that last year, and for people who don't know, it is still an ongoing project being led by several departments within the city, including DK's and the Department of Planning and Development, to create a long-term actual plan for the city of Chicago that will guide policies and priorities. And so Kwana and I were part of this overall team of, I think, 18 artists, being led by Honeypot Performance Collective, in using creative and artistic strategies for engaging with communities around specific pillar issues. And I think that was a learning experience for everybody involved. I was part of the mobile team. And so the four of us were charged actually not to, most of the other teams were located within 2 or 3 specific neighborhoods, but as part of the mobile team, we were supposed to like fill in the gaps in other neighborhoods. Yeah, I mean, Chicago is a place with where people are very strongly identified with their neighborhoods, and neighborhood institutions are very strongly, very strongly, I don't want to use the word turf, but turf, very strongly identified with the geographic area and the community. So to be a representative of the city, to be trying to do something that's actually meaningful in terms of engaging with the community in a way that's not extractive, and in a way that could actually lead to something that people can see the benefits of, takes a long time. And I think just with all of the good intentions and desires for community engagement, which has to happen, right? How is it? What are the conditions required for that to actually happen in a meaningful way? The amount of resource, the amount of time, and really, again, the relationships. Yeah. So we, us as artists, we're one prong of the community engagement strategy, and the city has several other kinds of committees happening now, and I trust and hope that that good things are happening, where people living in neighborhoods can actually have input into what goes into the final community plan.
Yeah, I am just thinking, continue to think about this notion of time. I
Mm,
feel like certainly over the last 2 years, my relationship to time has shifted. Um, and right, you're absolutely right that or I guess one of the questions that I have sort of coming out of the last 2 years is how do or how can, large governmental plans really invest in that time, right, so that we do get that sort of long-term kind of community building where it doesn't feel like we're sort of coming in and coming out after a couple of months, right? Certainly a project can end, yes, but also how do we sort of just value time to get to know each other, right? That's something that we're thinking about. I'm part of the sort of the new leadership circle of the Center for Performance and Civic Practice, which is, sort of artists from across the country. And, I think folks are experiencing this in other cities as well, right? And even with us as a cohort, right? Like to not have the pressure to produce, right? But to really, for a funder to say, sure, here's some money just for you all to be able to meet and connect for 2 years before you even get to the phase of figuring out what you want to do, I think is, quite refreshing, right? Just to be able to do this, right? Yeah, and it strengthens the work, right? And it strengthens sort of how we are able to sustain those community relationships.
yeah. Speaking of time, this is not exactly the same thing, but I had another question for you about history, because both of us do work that it looks at history and questions history and uses history as material. And yeah, I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on that, how you think about history in your work.
It's a great question. I'm trying to think if there's another case study except for rewriting the Declaration, certainly because that one is, we literally go back in time. So at the beginning of the play, they're in a classroom and they're talking about history, they're talking about elections, and then they take a virtual field trip to 1776. And then one of the students decides to steal the Declaration so that they can rewrite it, which is not that idea, that notion certainly came from the ensemble. So I just want to say that I don't want to take the credit for that idea, for that notion. But I really, for that piece, it started out as just kind of like a poetic wondering, right? What would happen, or if we sort of think about rewriting time or rewriting history, how might that shift our visions of the future, right? If we go back and if we think about the things, if we actually talk about the things that we don't talk about, right? How does that inform how we move forward together? And so I think at the broadest sense, that's how I sort of think about history, right? Is that it is absolutely vital for us to be aware, right? To be calling attention to the ways in which folks of color have been harmed, right? Like throughout history and not just in this moment, right? We have to contextualize it. We can't not talk about it. So yeah, I don't have any more eloquent thoughts than that. But would love to hear you sort of, share how you think about it.
Oh, I think for me, I'm a lot of my interest in history is because I grew up in this way where no one ever told me anything that came before. My parents, my family were not the kind of people who like talked about stories from the past. And so everything I've learned as context for what's happened in the present is because I had to go and find it. I had to go and read, mostly reading, and really like be very proactive in trying to learn about it. And it makes things make so much more sense. Like, you know, as I said, I moved around a lot to different countries, and we just got plopped down in the middle of what was happening, and no one explained anything at all. And so it's been really a way for me to understand that why things are the way they are now. And like as you're saying, like to have a sense that that means the future doesn't have to be the same way. So like, you know, doing research about these roads that had been made by Native people, like helped me imagine, oh, well, then maybe there's a future when they're not roads that are used in the way that they are now. Just knowing that things have been different, I think is so useful for me, to have a sense that they can be different in the future. Yeah.
I have a slightly separate, but I do think it's a related question for you. And I'm curious how you sort of think about audience for your work. Right. So you are building relationships with Native communities and bringing them in. You know, is the work at a large, that's an example, right? Like, is it for those folks that, you know, or is it, so I'm thinking about this, probably a false sort of dichotomy, right? But is it against something or a group of people, or for, right, a group of people? When we were building the rewriting the Declaration piece, we had a lot of conversation about, well, what is the role of white folks when they come to see this, right? And how do we sort of plant seeds for they know how to engage appropriately? But ultimately we were like, well, no, this isn't a play for them, right? It's celebrating folks of color. So I'm curious about how you think about that.
Yeah, that's a good question. I have generally thought of the audience for my works being me. So they're really for me. And so by definition, in some ways, they're not for a Native audience. They're for non-Native people primarily. It does seem to help to contradict the ongoing erasure of Native folks by having, you know, projects that that highlight, you know, their presence and visibility and voice. But I think, you know, I think generally, I think generally most of what I've done so far has been really, for me and for other non-Native audiences. That might change. We'll see. Yeah. Ramona, do you want to ask us anything, or?
Sure, but I also want to see if there is anyone who's here with us who would like to ask a question. I did want to share just some comments from the chat that have come in throughout the program so far. So, you know, some appreciation for the video that you shared, Quena. This is so good. Love this. It's powerful and relatable. And Gian, in response to what you were sharing about the Who's Lakefront project, that the CPS curriculum, Chicago Public Schools curriculum, does a horrible job of teaching about Indigenous history, right? And I think that's probably common throughout the country. It's not unique to the Chicago Public Schools. Yeah, I just wanted to pause for 1 second and just see if there's any, you know, I certainly can ask you lots of questions, but folks, feel free to share them in the chat as well if you would like. I do want to ask, so, you know, Gian, you talked about how liberating it's been to, you know, to be working apart from institutions right now. But I also feel like because the both of you do have some affiliations with academic institutions right now, and because obviously this is being hosted by an academic institution, I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't ask a little bit about that. And so I'm kind of wondering, you know, what role the work that you're doing, the work that you've been talking about, how that is connected to your work in academia. You know, how are you bringing that work into academia? How are you bringing your academic pursuits into the work? Or, what place does it have there, if any? And is it, in what, like, how is it received by colleagues and the students? How do you talk about it? Have there been challenges that you have faced in doing that, or has it opened up new opportunities for you? So both as educators, but also, Quenna, you're a doctoral student right now, right? So if you can talk a little bit about that, I think that might be interesting for folks here, particularly folks who are here from UIC or other academic institutions, to hear about.
I think my thoughts are a bit scattered, so I'll try to focus. Yes, I am currently a student. I literally just yesterday morning emailed a dissertation draft to my committee, so hopefully we'll be done very soon. But the focus of that project is the play, right? And so I am in a space. It's an educational theater program. Where that's what I'm studying. And they were the ones actually to invite me to make the play as part of the main stage season for the department. And I don't know to what extent that was sort of happening before. Like, any of the shows that I saw were not student written. And so since then, it's been really awesome to see that that's what the main stages have become, is like student work, which I think is really, really awesome. I'm not going to claim that I'm the first. I have no idea. But it certainly became more visible, more potential, I think. So just to say, right, that I think in that institution, I have absolutely felt welcomed and supported, right, through my mentors to really have to open up that kind of space that we were able to do with that particular show. It was co-produced by them and by Free Street Theater, which I think, is also this interesting model, right? Well, first of all, they're in two different cities, right? So I'm in school in New York. And the Free Street Theater is a Chicago-based company, which has this sort of free model, right? It's pay what you can. They support folks coming to see shows in a number of ways. One of those is they, were the only theater that I heard of where they provide childcare at certain number of shows. So they really have been at the forefront of thinking about accessibility in lots of kinds of ways. And so I thought that was, really amazing that we were able to have that kind of a partnership, just, because I had been working on the play with Free Street before I went to school, and, I could not invite them into that conversation, right? And so I think that is one way that we can continue, that institutions can, like these universities, right, can continue to support artists working in communities and working with local organizations. And then right now, what I'm teaching at DePaul is called Social Justice Ensemble, right? So it's social, it's all the things that I do. It's all of the things that people inspire me do, right? So we're talking about Anna Deavere Smith's work, which is verbatim and ethno theater. We look at, kind of a high level dive into theater of the oppressed. So really just all of these ways of using theater in a non-traditional context, which I think for fourth year acting students who are, ready to enter the world as serious actors was a bit, they didn't know how to handle it in some ways, right? And certainly some of those young folks had been interested in creating their own work, had a sense of wanting to incorporate elements of social justice in their work, but not everybody. And so I think that has been really an interesting tension to navigate. It's like, well, how do you, expose folks to these particular areas when they haven't been at all in part of their conservatory training? And so that is what I would say to institutions is, right, like, how do we start that earlier, that folks know that those are options, because also, like, you can create work, right? You can work with communities and continue to create opportunities, both for yourself, right, and for the communities that you're working with and for, and not kind of just have to wait for the gig to appear. And that, I don't know if that's the same in sort of visual art world, but in performance, right, like that's a lot of when you leave acting school, like you're waiting to get to book the gig, right? And so I'm like, well, let's how do we get some other skills, and also, right, like how do we find the things that we're really passionate, like what else are we passionate about, what are the things that have been impacting us, and how do we, right, use all of the tools that we've been learning to sort of say something about that.
When I left the PhD program in ethnic studies, I wrote a little manifesto for myself of all the things that had made me unhappy, so that if I were ever tempted to go back, I would know exactly why I had left and what the conditions would be if I ever returned. Yeah, so kudos to you, Quanah, for surviving and it looks like thriving through a PhD program. That's incredible. Mainly, I think that academic institutions are a tool for white supremacist racial capitalism, for creating wealth for people who are not us. Their function is to gatekeep and generate certain kinds of quote unquote knowledge that will serve the status quo. So the fact that anything human ever happens within an academic institution, I think, is a triumph. I think generally, like, enough of that is allowed to happen so that people can actually survive, but that's not their intent. So I think that there are ways that being part of an academic institution can be useful, and often people are able to figure out how to use certain aspects of it in ways that are good for themselves or good for larger liberation projects. But you have to, for anyone who's a student here, you have to know that that's what's happening. You have to understand that it's not your job to go in there to change it, because it's not a thing that can be reformed. So what and it was really interesting working on the Lakefront project, because we were advised to get support, letters of support from cultural institutions and higher ed institutions, especially those located downtown along Michigan Avenue, to help our case for getting a permit. We talked to several colleges and universities, and whoever we talked to, they're also, no matter what their personal support was for the project or for projects like that, they're also having to navigate structures within their institutions. Definitely, I got help. We were able to store the sand at SAIC. National Louis University hosted a workshop session. Others, did provide letters of support. But in all those cases, like the human aspect of anything happening there is like pushing against what the larger field and what institutions are trying to do, which is to generate wealth. So that's what I would say. I think just if I had known that earlier in my life, it would have saved me some heartache. Because I think, we all want to, believe that people and institutions they're looking out for us, that we have a place, that we belong somewhere, that, that this is a place of learning. I think to hold that with one part of your mind and understand that that's not actually what they're constructed for, that knowing that was useful for me. And maybe it can be useful for other people too.
Thank you both. Chewing on that. I just wanted to share a note from the comment, or a comment from the chat. So from Kelly, thank you so much for allowing us to listen in on your conversation. You are giving me so much to think about, and your work is amazing. I think, we're almost out of time. And I want to leave you with a closing question, which you've touched on a little bit, and I think comes through in your work just because of what it is. But I'm wondering if you can kind of expand on it a little bit. And I want to know, how do you find or create healing and joy in your work? Particularly because you're dealing with some really tough topics and issues in your work. So if you can speak to that a little bit, I think I'd like to hear about that. Think about it for a little bit first.
I'm happy to jump in, Gian, if you want some more time to chew. I was in a fellowship last year, the year before last, and similar to this discussion, right, was talking about a lot of the work that I did. And this question came up. People were like, all of your work is so heavy. Is there anything that you do that's just about joy? And I think in that moment, the answer was, well, there was also, like, you have to sort of start with joy in the heavy work, and you have to end with, right, like it doesn't, it's always there, and so any of the processes that I'm leading, whether as a director or deviser or facilitator, right, it does start with play. Like that's how we sort of build community, right, is through games and through play. And so that is always a core element in any of the work that I'm making. For myself, I am learning to rest, learning to say no, and that has been healing for me, so that I can create and continue to work in community. And yeah, something that I want to work on next actually is a web series, just about, like, the joys of being a Black woman. And it won't center traumas, or, like, certainly those things will be a part of it because that's just part of our experience. But really asking this question of, like, well, how do we just center the joy and the wackiness that of daily life too. So being intentional, right, is how I do that.
Thank you. That was useful to hear. Let's see. I love meeting people. I love meeting people who care about the same things, and just, like, hearing how people's minds work. So that's a big part of the joy, is having, like I said, like having a vehicle to open up conversations with people that otherwise I'd just be all like, just like awkward and like not know what to say. But, now I have a project, so I need to talk to you. So I find lots of joy in that, and just people are great. People are funny. It's anyway, like, in the last 2 years of the pandemic, I've met so many people. Like, it's incredible. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is, I really like singing. I really like karaoke, and I really hope to have more of that in my life as things open back up from the lockdown. I'm just very excited about that. In art school, I did an 8-hour karaoke performance, and that was one of the funnest things I've ever done. But then the last thing I'll say is that one of the things that's been so great about meeting people through my work is meeting people, like I said, who are thinking about similar things and who care about similar things. And I think that there is joy in having a platform and an opportunity to speak truth, right? Like, getting to say what you see and what is happening and what has happened, I think, for me, is a joyous thing.
I think that is a really beautiful and profound way to end this program. That was so lovely, Gian. Oh my goodness. Okay. I could talk with both of you for hours. Actually, I could just sit back and listen to the two of you talk with each other for hours. This is absolutely wonderful. You're getting lots of accolades and thank yous in the chat. Really, Gian Lee, Quenna Barrett, thank you both so much for joining us today. Everybody who's here, thank you for spending time with us this afternoon. Once again, I want to invite you all. We have a lot of events still coming up the rest of the semester. Tomorrow begins Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so we have programs specifically around that, but also just some great opportunities to get involved. And once again, I'm dropping that link in the chat. I want to thank, again, Pam for providing captions today, Sydney for providing backup tech support. Thank you, Gian. Thank you, Quenna. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful evening, wonderful rest of your day. Thanks, everybody. Take care.